With your building permit in hand, your offer to connect in hand, and your conditional offer, you can then go ahead and install your project. The installation is relatively short. I mean, it could take, for a microfit project, it could take 2 days, it could take 4 days. We're saying it'll most likely happen within a week. So trust your installer, your turnkey project manager, to have their timeline in place, whereby as soon as you have your building permit and all your other forms, they're ready to get to your house and they're ready to install. With the installation complete, you can then go ahead with the connection process. The connection process involves 3 steps. One is an ESA inspection. That's the Electrical Safety Authority in Ontario. They need to inspect all the branch work for your solar installation and determine that it's all up to code. That can take up to 2 weeks to have an inspector actually come out to your house, since they are very busy at the moment. The next step is to actually have the LDC come out and install your meter and connect the system itself. This can also take a bit of time. It can take about 2 weeks to coordinate that, since again the LDC is very busy at the moment. Another issue to keep in mind is that due to some changes, you are no longer allowed to connect your project in series, which means you cannot connect your solar photovoltaic system behind your own meter. You now have to create a separate meter, so your system is now connected in parallel. And what that involves is shutting off your electricity, and depending on the way your electricity is delivered, you may have to shut off electricity within your neighborhood as well. And so this is a bit of a complicated process at times, and it could take a bit of time to complete. Finally, you receive the information that the LDC collects is then submitted to the OPA, and the OPA will then send you a confirmation of your contract. They've received confirmation that you are now ready to put electricity into the grid, and they then sign your final contract, and you get paid for every kilowatt that you inject into the grid from that day forward. So the total process I have here is sort of a generic example, can take up to 133 days. So we're talking roughly 6 months. Now that's conservative. It's a conservative estimate. It can take less time, and hopefully it would take less time. Or it could take a lot more. That's true. There are always snags, and like I said, this is just a generic example, and every situation is going to be different. So you'll notice that I had a few benchmarks on that timeline, and these are areas that money will be owed, essentially. Money is owed, first of all, for your site inspection. You should really make sure that whichever company is performing your site inspection is actually performing a detailed inspection, and to do that it takes quite a bit of work, and if they're doing it for free, then I would say most likely they are not as qualified, or they are just starting out in the business and looking for work. So we have $150 as a sort of an estimate for your site inspection. Most companies will refund that inspection when they actually confirm a contract with you. They will say, okay, we'll offer you the site inspection for $150. We will refund that from your turnkey cost should you choose to use us as your installer. Once your application is accepted, most companies will then ask for a deposit. This is used to purchase the hardware that is needed for your system. I've put up the number of 40%. These are rough figures. Bear in mind that each company will be different. The next step is once you have installed your project, the company will then ask for an additional deposit, most likely roughly in the neighborhood of 40%. So at this point you've paid 80% of your project cost. Once you have your connection, they will ask for the balance of the cost. Now there is no, with the new system in place, there is no threat that you will have installed the system and then find out that there is no connection. Because they have this new regulation in place, you can safely install your system knowing that you will be connected, and that is guaranteed. So you should have no problems with this payment scheme. I just wanted to go through a few irregularities within the process. One being that under the Ontario Building Code, you are not required to have a building permit for ground mount projects. Whereas, again, as I mentioned, you are required to have one for rooftop projects. However, any rooftop project less than 4 panels, you are not required to have a building permit. However, that being said, less than 4 panels is less than 1 kilowatt, and your return on investment for a 1 kilowatt project is ridiculous. So it's not something that's even worth considering. Just briefly, since there are a few gentlemen here who are looking at FIT programs, FIT scale projects. The process, in general terms, it follows the same sequence. However, there are a few differences along the way. One being that even prior to December 8th, you had to contact your local distribution company prior to even submitting an application. And they perform an assessment which is known as a Form A, or they request information which is known as a Form A. That Form A talks about the type of connection, the size of project, the voltage you're using, and there are many, many other details that they ask for. But those Form A's are available online on Hydro One's website, and you can check those out. The application process, from the time that you submit it to the time that it's granted, is much longer. This is because they are processing these applications in blocks, and they are waiting until they collect a certain number with a certain capacity before they release them. And so your application processing period may be 6 months, maybe longer, maybe 8, maybe 10. These are bigger projects, and so they take a lot more time to process. You would then need to also perform, and this is an additional step with the feed-in tariff, you need to perform a connection impact assessment, which is known as the Form B. And this is a more detailed analysis of your connection and the impact that it would have on the grid itself. So this is an additional step with the feed-in tariff. Building permits are required, and upon the receipt of that Form B and your building permit, they then issue a notice to proceed. And that notice to proceed is equivalent to a conditional offer. And what I'm being told within the industry is that, in terms of this political question of yours, what I'm being told from large developers, large-scale developers, that if you have your notice to proceed, then you are essentially, you are safe in terms of whether or not there's a change in government. Now again, Matthew will obviously say we need to indemnify ourselves and say anything is possible, but this is what the talk within the industry is. Following your notice to proceed, you go ahead with your construction. Again, your construction can take a couple of weeks, can take 1 week, depends on the size of your system. Bear in mind that these projects for FIT are anywhere between 11 kilowatts and 10 to 100 megawatts. Now, I don't expect anyone here to be producing 10 megawatt scale projects. However, these are large scale projects, and so they will take a bit more time. With the connection in place, you then, with the construction in place, you then go through the connection process. Here again, you have an ESA inspection. You have the connection process with the LDC, and you have your contract with the OPA. Now, the differences in terms of the payment scheme with the FIT process are that you have performance security deposits throughout the process. And these are to ensure that as you enter into a contract with the OPA, these security deposits are meant to ensure that you will complete your project, since they are allocating that capacity to your project. They want to ensure that it will be built. And so you have a performance security deposit once your application has been granted, and you have another one due upon your receipt of your notice to proceed. And these are essentially $25 per kilowatt for the first performance security deposit, and $50 per kilowatt for the second performance security deposit. There's also an application fee associated with the FIT program. The application fee is 50 cents per kilowatt, with a minimum fee of 500 up to a maximum of 5,000. And so those are the additional fees that are levied under the FIT program. The FIT process irregularities, because these are larger scale projects, they fall under different categories. The most common category, and the one that ideally you would all be under, is a capacity allocation exempt project, whereby there is capacity within the grid, and so they would not need to expand the transmission or distribution grids in order to accommodate your project. If you do not fall under the capacity allocation exempt category, then you would then need to go through an economic connection test, whereby they determine if it is economically viable for them to expand the grid and expand transmission capacity. in order to allow your project to connect. And that's a lengthy process. One other point to make regarding the FIT program is that if you are considering ground-mounted projects, there are restrictions on the size that you can build based on the class of agricultural land you have. So classes 1, 2, and 3 agricultural land cannot build projects larger than 100 kilowatts. This is to ensure that our good farmland is not being used up. So, determining your rate of return. I mentioned that an installer will come with some sort of a solar access determining device. This is essentially the readout that it produces. It's a fisheye view of your property, your rooftop or ground property, whatever it may be. The clear access is in yellow, the shading is in green, and it determines how much solar radiation you will be receiving on your site. Again, it takes into consideration things like latitude, orientation, the usable space, obstructions and hazards. They will also determine if your rooftop needs to be replaced before you go ahead with the project. And that determines how much projected solar output you will receive throughout the year. So this is on a monthly basis. You see that most of it is in the summer, released in the winter. And this is the amount of kilowatts that you could potentially produce based on a particular size system at your site. From that, they can determine how much revenue you will generate based on that output. You simply multiply your output by the rate that the government is offering for that scale of project. So for a microfit project, anything less than 10 kilowatts, you will be offered 80.2 cents per kilowatt. Based on your rate of return, they can then calculate your cash flow, your cumulative cash flow over 20 years. So for this project, this is just an example. You can see that the break-even point for this project is roughly 8.5 years, which means you would have paid off your system at that point in time, and the remaining 11.5 years are positive cash flow. Now, I say positive cash flow, I don't like to use that term because your project could be financed by any number of means, and so your cash flow could be positive from day one, depending on the ratio of debt to equity financing you use. So I won't go into that because every situation is different, but that's something to keep in mind. I was just about to get to that. Yeah. So I will skip ahead since you asked that question now. When you are having your ROI determined by a solar assessor, there are other considerations to take into account other than just the cost of the system, the upfront cost, and the rate of return you're going to receive. You also need to keep in consideration that you will have to pay insurance. You will have to insure the system, I'm assuming you would want to. You will have to pay income tax on this revenue. Again, we don't go into the specifics because everyone's financial situation is different. Whether or not you have this system under a business name or under a spouse's name, no, we don't want to get into that because that's something you can work out with your accountant. But you will have to pay income tax. For ground-mounted systems, you will also have to keep into consideration that your property tax is affected. Property tax is not necessarily affected for a roof mount system because it's considered an electricity producing device, and that does not affect your property tax.
They could raise your property tax?
For ground mount.
For ground mount.
Because it alters the classification of your land. And so it puts it into a different property tax category.